in each of our lives, you might say, we begin in a Garden of Eden. We begin kind of in a state of innocence, simplicity, harmony as young children. But as we grow and develop, we sort of experience alienation. We don't always do the things we think we should do. We feel shame and guilt in relation to others, or we feel like we're trying to discover our place in the world. I think that's just part of the maturation of each human life. And so that's why I think to really get at like the role of spirituality in human life, I think you have to make a case that there's like a spiritual predicament that we're trying to address.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. As human beings, we are driven to pursue meaning and fullness in our lives. But is this kind of spiritual yearning a human universal? How do we express this deep longing? And what happens when we become alienated from it? And what happens if some people say they don't experience it at all? Can religion guide us towards this kind of fulfillment, or might it also be a source of that very alienation? And once someone leaves religion, how does the spiritual yearning continue? To address these questions, I'm interviewing a psychologist and a philosopher who are working to make sense of these topics from different perspectives. Daryl Van Tongeren is professor of psychology and the director of the Frost Center for Social Science Research at Hope College. As a social psychologist, he uses experimental research to investigate meaning in life, religion, and identity and virtues. His latest book is Done: How to Flourish After Leaving Religion. David McPherson is a professor of philosophy in the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education, an affiliate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Florida. His most recent book is The Virtues of Limits. Let's get started. All right, Daryl and David, it's so good to see you guys. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, great to see you, Brandon.
Hey, you too. It's such a pleasure. All right, so I'm going to start by asking each of you to share a memory of beauty, of profound beauty that maybe has lingered with you since childhood. David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sounds great. I was thinking about this. Actually, the thing that came to mind, interestingly, was my relationship to my grandparents as a young kid. As a philosopher, I think have a sort of keen sense of mortality and sort of this deep connection I had with my grandparents, and just a sense of time and the sort of like preciousness of life and sort of through generations. And so I think it's probably, one might think of like natural landscapes or some, picture, but I think people, and especially I think like aging is beautiful. You think of like Rembrandt's paintings of like the old woman, and I know there's something like, I don't know, so I was sort of deeply moving, and I suppose I've always been sort of an old soul. And it's part of maybe what drew me to philosophy is a sense of one's mortality and the preciousness of life. And so, if I think about like what was kind of something that sort of, when I think about beauty, I think of something that sort of like draws you out in some way, some good that sort of draws you out of yourself. It sort of moves you in a deep way. And I think sort of the beauty of like one's family, especially one's grandparents, and sort of confronting the fragility of life and our mortality, I think has always been sort of deeply moving to me. And so like I think there's something beautiful in old age and kind of that relationship between the generations. Yeah, I think that's sort of what comes to mind. If you were asking me like something in my childhood, it was sort of like the beauty of that sort of relationship with one's grandparents.
Was there any particular aspect or any particular memory from that relationship? I'm trying to think back. I didn't know my grandparents too well, but I don't have memories that I would consider beautiful. I mean, I have very, very fleeting memories of seeing them once in a while.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think, things just like going fishing with my grandpa. Like we'd go out fishing all day on the boat, and it just was like a very important experience for me as a young kid. And of course, I'd go fishing, hunting with my dad too. But this sort of intergenerational relationship that was always this deep bond. And so some of my experiences of beauty also just being out in nature, but also having that be a kind of connection between my dad, my grandpa, and then just other things. Grandparents were very involved in our lives. And so, it was always something that was important to me. And I remember like giving a speech at I think it was their 40th anniversary, maybe 50th anniversary. I just was like choked up, and it wasn't clear like why I was choked up giving this speech.
How old were you?
I was probably like 20. And so maybe it was their 50th. Okay. I'm trying to, it was back a ways now though. Both of them have passed on at this point, but I know those are sort of like deep things, as sort of like bonds you have as, young
Yeah.
child getting older, and then like kind of confronting aging and mortality. And so I don't know, I just had a lot. They would come to all of our like baseball games and everything, and so it
Nice.
was very involved in our lives, and it was something deeply moving to me. So I think of beauty as something that's deeply moving and sort of draws you out and helps you to find the beauty and goodness of life. So
Awesome. Daryl, what comes to your mind?
For me, I was born in California and then was raised there until middle school. Then my family and I moved to Colorado. And so for me, it was the first time I saw snow. There was just something deeply moving. I felt like I had a Kierkegaardian set of emotions of both awe and dread. Right. So being a Californian, seeing the snow, I was a little nervous, a little afraid. Like, well, what is this? Is this scary? Is this a threat? But also this sense of awe of something that was so unfamiliar, so foreign, but also so beautiful. And so it was this beautiful mixture of fear and excitement and curiosity. I'll never kind of quite forget that first snow. It's kind of stuck with me.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely an experience of the sublime, I imagine, the combination of beauty and fear. How old were you? Do you remember when you...
I think I was 11 when I
Okay,
first saw
okay.
snow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was 20 when I first saw snow. I moved from Dubai to Nova Scotia. So
Oh, wow.
it's quite an
That's a
interesting...
shift.
Yeah. I remember very vividly the first snowfall, the winter of '99. So, well, I want to ask you, Daryl, maybe to start, tell me a little bit about like your own journey into psychology and into the work you do in the study of religion, and then especially about your recent book, Done. But could you briefly trace your trajectory into how you were led to pursue a career in psychology and then this particular area of research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went away, I'm the first generation college student. And when I entered college, I came with the parental mandate that I had to choose something very practical. And so I was a business major.
Me too, for
And I
that reason.
realized,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. I realized very quickly, though, I'm not very good at business. And so the class that I really loved, though, my first semester of college was Intro to Psych. And so my second semester, I remained a business major because that's what I needed to do, but I was secretly taking all of these upper level psych courses, even though I never switched major. So eventually switched majors, had the difficult conversation with the parents and said, I'm not going into business, I'm going into psych. And I think I've always been interested in some of the bigger questions around human existence. And so I think psychological science offers a unique window into some of those. And so even just very early on, my senior undergraduate thesis focused on religion and death anxiety. And so I think I started engaging with psychological research around religion since I was an undergrad, because these big questions, enduring questions, have always just drawn me in more than some of the other things. And so for a long time, I studied how religion is a meaning system and some of the social cognitive functions of religion. But then shortly after finding out I had gotten tenure, I was going on a run with one of my friends, and we were kind of celebrating that I'd gotten tenure. And he said, what's something that you've always wanted to study, but you haven't, but now that you have the security of tenure, you feel like you can explore. And I thought, well, people leaving religion. And he's like, well, why on earth? Like, why now? Why not later? And I'm at a religious institution, and I was a little worried, how would my scholarship be perceived? And also, I think that the idea of leaving religion is a fraught topic. So people on both sides, it's very charged. And so he encouraged me to pursue this. So with a separate colleague, we wrote a grant, and we got some funding from the John Templeton Foundation to conduct cross-cultural research on religious de-identification and what we call the religious duns. So people who are leaving religion. And since then, this has been one of the most rewarding areas of my scholarship. And I'm really grateful for the encouragement of that colleague who, said that, now's the time for intellectual curiosity and courage. So jump after that.
Yeah. It's really a fantastic book, and I think it's great to coin that term and to distinguish it from the religious nuns, right? So which is what a lot of, I think, the research has been focused on, is people who are not affiliated with any religion and how that population is growing. Do you see the population of religious duns as also growing, or what is the? And I think in your book you say about 20% of Americans are in this category. But what is your sense of the rate of change of this category and its future?
I do think that this category is increasing. So there's some statistics that 1 in 3 people raised Christian will leave their faith by the time they reach 30. Some estimates are as high as maybe 3/4 of religious nuns are actually duns. They've actually left a faith. And so I do see the proliferation of the duns. I do think that more people are going to be walking away from their faith. And I think there are a few reasons why we might be seeing that. So in my book, I call these the 4 horsemen of religion's apocalypse. So 4 reasons why religion might be experiencing a decline. So one is because of what I call, and research participants have told us, so we call this cultural stagnation. So they give intellectual reasons. They say, I'm becoming more progressive, but my religious institutions aren't. And there's this gap between the values I espouse and the ones my institution promotes. And I simply can't make sense of those anymore. A second is because of religious and spiritual abuse or trauma. And so either they have experienced this abuse or trauma, or they've witnessed it, right? They've witnessed religious leaders or clergy perpetuating this trauma, and they can't stand the moral hypocrisy, and so they have to leave. Third reason is because of theologically thin views of suffering. So when adversity strikes, they simply can't make sense of how a loving God or a just world could allow such tragedy to befall them or someone that they love. And then the fourth reason is because religion, and particularly in the US, evangelical, has taken on a social label that many people are not comfortable with. So a recent poll showed that 40% of self-identified evangelicals do not affirm the deity of Jesus, which I'm pretty sure is like the core thing it means to be an evangelical. So well, what this means is that evangelical probably has a more socio-political term that some people don't want to be a part of. So there's a number of reasons why people are leaving, and I think these reasons are going to lead to an increase in the religious duns.
Yeah. I could identify with a lot of those categories. And when I was growing up, I grew up Hindu, and I think I left religion for 3 of those reasons. So everything besides religious trauma, I could identify with, and certainly the simplistic views of suffering. My mother became severely mentally ill when I was a child. I just could not find any kind of theological resource that was offered to me by at least the way the tradition was communicated to me, and the practices didn't seem very helpful and so forth. But yeah, then I became Roman Catholic just before the 2002 sex abuse scandal erupted. So
wow, just in time.
Just in time for religious trauma.
Yes.
But one of the things you talk about is that these 4 horsemen are all forms of cognitive dissonance, right? This sort of mismatch between, could you say a little bit about cognitive dissonance and then the kind of responses of assimilation and accommodation, I think, that you talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So in my mind, all 4 of these things, there's a discrepancy between what people have been taught or they've learned or somehow internalized, right? So their expectations or assumptions around the world and their experiences of the world. So there's this gap. So psychologists call this inconsistency cognitive dissonance. It's a negative mental and physiologically arousing state. And we're really motivated to do something to reduce this dissonance. We don't like it when there's inconsistencies. And so Crystal Park's research on meaning suggests that the bigger the discrepancy between our expectations and reality, the greater the distress. And so for minor inconsistencies, or if people have a worldview that's able to do this, kind of our first pass at trying to resolve the cognitive dissonance is to assimilate our experiences into our existing religious structures, beliefs, or framework. So basically, we try to make it fit. We try to make sense with the religious beliefs that we have. And if we can effectively assimilate that, the discrepancy goes away, the distress goes away, and we maintain our beliefs. If the discrepancy is too big and the distress is too big, and you simply can't make sense and you can't fit it into your existing belief structures, you accommodate them. And what that means is you just change them. And we're hesitant to change them, especially something as big and important as religion. We don't really want to change these beliefs, but oftentimes, sometimes we have to. And so when we accommodate, that's when we undergo this wholesale belief change or significant belief change. And for a lot of people, that might mean leaving religion altogether.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is there a third option, Daryl? I was wondering whether there might be a way of just sort of standing in between that, with it, holding the tension, right? Where you know that there's something in the world that you can't quite, assimilate into your religious beliefs. At the same time, you don't want to change those beliefs. Is that, do people navigate that middle space?
I think I'm secretly an advocate for that middle space. So So I think that middle space is rare for a number of reasons. I think that middle space requires us to tolerate uncertainty, and that's very uncomfortable for many people. And we're drawn to beliefs and worldviews and ideologies that provide us with certainty and sure security. I think it also requires intellectual humility to be able to say, I don't know. Yeah, the world's a wild place. Evil exists, but I also think there's good and there's beauty. I can't make sense of this, even though they pay me as an academic to pontificate on why this might be the case. And so there takes some humility in order to do that. And so all of this kind of revolves around the idea that in order to stay in that middle space, I think what we need to do is we need to cultivate an existential distress tolerance. So we need to be okay with existential anxiety. We need to become comfortable with uncertainty and not knowing and saying, I'm probably wrong and I just don't know. And that's culturally very challenging. Those things are not valued or valorized in our culture. And so you're swimming against cultural currents. But second, it's also personally challenging to be able to withstand that amount of distress. But I don't think it's impossible. I think that would be my encouragement, is to the degree that we can cultivate more existential resilience and a distress tolerance, we're going to be less likely to act out of trying to manage existential anxiety and respond defensively or foreclose on ideas. And it allows us to remain open. So kind of this, maybe this is a bit of a leap, but in the same way, like when I first saw snow, I was terrified, but I was also drawn to it, right? There was dread, but there was also awe. I think when we undergo changes, or when we can't understand and explain things, and we're sitting in the existential distress tolerance, that is terrifying. There is some dread, but it's also expansive. You're also overwhelmed with seeing the world in a new way. You can appreciate your relative smallness to something bigger than yourself, and there's a sense of awe that really is motivating. And so being able to hold both of those seemingly competing emotions at the same time, I think might be, as you mentioned, a really fruitful way forward.
Yeah, no, thank you. That sounds amazing. I just interviewed this journalist, Maggie Jackson, who wrote a remarkable book called Uncertain, and she advocates for uncertainty as a sort of psychological superpower. And yeah, and I think certainly it's related to humility, which we can talk about in a little bit. So maybe, David, let me ask you about your journey into philosophy. You mentioned being an old soul as a child, but I'd be curious to know just how you decided to become a professional philosopher, and tell us a little bit about your journey into the study of virtue and humility and then now alienation.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I sort of like indicated maybe some of those motivations. I think I grew up religious, and I think probably when I was a teenager, I started having, a bunch of questions, doubts, problem of evil, all these sorts of things. And so I think I kind of felt impelled to philosophize. Aristotle famously at the beginning of his Metaphysics says, philosophy begins with wonder. And that sounds really nice. It's like, it almost sounds like this nice euphoric experience, but it's really something like being perturbed. He says, like, we philosophize in order to no longer be at a loss in the world. And so I think philosophy, sort of the ancient practice of philosophy as a way of life, is this attempt to sort of discover an orientation in one's life, to discover wisdom, wisdom as a kind of understood as kind of holistic understanding that sort of aims at living well. And so I think philosophy has, has always been part of that human quest. I mean, I always try to impress this upon my students, is that we're all natural philosophers. We all ask these questions all the time. And in fact, part of a philosophy course, should be to help you, one of the things that should help you do is have your midlife crisis early, so you don't have to go buy the Lamborghini later, which isn't going to solve your problems. Not that I actually want you to have the crisis, but I want you to address the kinds of questions from which crises arise, and so which are just part of the human condition. And so, in that sense, I think I just felt impelled to do philosophy, to sort of inquire into some of these big questions about meaning in life, how to live well. And so I think, you asked about virtue ethics. So my first two books have been on virtue ethics. One called Virtue and Meaning, which is kind of virtue ethics and meaning of life. And the second one called The Virtues of Limits. And now my current book project is more kind of philosophy of the spiritual life, the book project is called Spiritual Alienation, The Quest for God. But I think virtue ethics always seemed to me like it allowed you to reflect upon the good life. Going back to ancient tradition, these big questions were just part of, you look at Aristotle, Plato, the big questions about sort of the nature of the world and our place within it are just so much a part of that. And I think I have tried to push virtue ethics in a kind of more, there's always these pressures in sort of academia to kind of narrow in, and I think there's value in that. But sometimes we lose like the big picture, the big questions. And so, for instance, in contemporary virtue ethics, they sort of don't talk about Aristotle and contemplation. They don't have much place for the contemplative life. Whereas it seems to me like it's obviously very central to Aristotle, this sort of the place for the contemplative life. And he thinks that the best kind of life would be the contemplative life. And there's sort of a question, how do you sort of square that with also the practical life engaged in human community, which I think there's interesting questions around that. But for the most part, a lot of contemporary Aristotelians have just been kind of concerned with how do we use practical reason to live well, to flourish. But part of flourishing, I mean, like part of the kind of beings we are is that we are, as I put it, meaning-seeking animals, that we seek meaning in our lives. And to flourish as a human being is to flourish in the mode of like being a meaning-seeking animal. And so I think a lot of times contemporary virtue ethicists have attempted to try to make their views sort of scientifically respectable. So they'll talk about like flourishing of like a tomato plant or like a dog or whatever. So like human flourishing is like that. And I think there are analogies, but there's also disanalogies. And one of the disanalogies is that we seek meaning in life. And so Aristotle himself said that non-human animals are not capable of eudaimonia, which is, the Greek term often translated as happiness. But I think it's something more like a meaningful life, a noble life, a worthwhile life, something that's deeply fulfilling. And so, I think that we have to get at like, what is it to be human? I think an essential sort of part of my own research is what we might call philosophical anthropology, sort of philosophical reflection on the human condition. What is it to be human? And so I think virtue ethics is sort of a way into that, to think about, well, how do we flourish as human beings? How do we live well? And the virtues are the excellences that help us to live well. Again, part of that's going to be meaning seeking, that part of, the virtues help us to live meaningful lives. That in fact, when the virtues help us to be properly responsive to the goods all around us, and in being properly responsive to those goods, we find fulfillment or meaning in our lives. And so that's sort of the sort of general picture. And I think sort of why I was drawn into virtue ethics. I think my work has tried to push it more in a kind of, as I've already indicated, meaning of life direction, but also in the direction of spirituality. That it's not so far from saying we're the meaning-seeking animal to saying we're like fundamentally religious or spiritual by nature. Homo religiosus, as if you want to use a Latin term here. And so, I think the present book project is trying to grapple with what you might call our spiritual condition or spiritual predicament from a philosophical vantage point.
Yeah, no, it's great. In your book on spirituality, you have defined spirituality as a practical life orientation shaped by what is taken to be a self-transcending source of meaning, which involves strong normative demands, including demands of the sacred, of the reverence-worthy, which I thought was a really compelling definition of spirituality. And I recently interviewed on the podcast Alan Lightman, who identifies as a spiritual materialist. So he's sort of ontologically, he's, committed to materialism, doesn't think that we're anything more than atoms and molecules. And yet he's had these profound experience of transcendence. And he thinks that's what spirituality is. It's being open to those kinds of experiences. What do you think about, like, what do you mean here, I suppose, by self-transcendence? And he wants to use that word transcendence as well. Because often we think of transcendent as implying something beyond the material world. How much of that is needed in your sense of spirituality?
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, just on the first part of that definition, so I describe it as a practical life orientation. So by practical, I mean, it's a life of practice, or they might say you have to engage in certain kinds of spiritual practices. It's not enough, in my view. I mean, this is, it's a normative definition, like how we think we should understand spirituality. So people could, of course, use the term in all kinds of different ways. So it could just be you have some wow moments, like there's people who like on psychedelics or something, like where you could have these
Right.
wow moments, right? This sort of question is like, maybe that could be a route into the spiritual life for someone. But there's sort of this question of like, or this issue of like spiritual praxis, that you have to engage in some way in spiritual practices, in a way trying to orient your life. This life orientation towards some vision of the good, we might say. And I think that gets into this sort of self-transcending aspect. I think there's some sense that I think the spiritual life, you feel called to something. You feel, if you think about like Christ beginning his ministry, calling people to metanoia, to repentance or conversion, right? There's some sense, I think, that the spiritual life responds to a call upon our lives to change, to be reborn, however you think of sort of the great spiritual traditions. They sort of issue a call upon one's life to be changed. And that I think necessarily has to sort of be experienced as coming to us from without. So sometimes I'm currently teaching this class on the search for meaning in a secular age. And so we'll get into like what do people mean when they're spiritual but not religious? And this sort of gets into what's religion, what's spirituality. And there are some sort of test cases. I don't know if either you remember this example from Robert Bell et al.'s book, Habits of the Heart, where there's this woman, Sheila, who had her own
Right.
religion of
Sheilaism.
Sheilaism,
Yeah.
right? And
Right.
there's sort of this question of like, could that be like a spirituality or religion where it's just like, you do you, I'll do me. Like, and there's a sense in which there's like, I mean, there could be, I think, like some sense of an authentic self, who you really ought to be, right? But if it's just kind of like, I'm going to do whatever I desire, no demand, there's sort of no fundamental restructuring of my desires or my orientation. I don't I mean, so part we're trying to capture a phenomenon, like what has spirituality been and what can it be sort of going into the future. And I think that sense of like the call upon, that's why I talk about certain
Mm.
certain normative demands upon, including a sense of the sacred, the holy, the numinous, right? So we're trying to capture something that seemed very important in the human condition, something that seems, for me, I'm interested in it as like a key ingredient in a flourishing human life. So what is the kind of spirituality that we we need in order to flourish as human beings, as sort of meaning seeking homo religiosus, or maybe by nature spiritual beings. And so that's why I think, I mean, my definition, I think, will sort of like say, well, some of these views, they may have elements of like spirituality, but it's not kind of the full package of at least what I think spirituality is at its best.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful I think to try to delineate those things. And it seems to me, and I've met people who are, at least espouse a kind of Sheilaism, right? They have this sort of little bricolage mentality in terms of the kind of spirituality they want to construct. And I don't think they can escape the demands, even if they say, well, I'm going to practice some yoga and then I'm going to go to this sort of nudist retreat on this beach with other people. I mean, whatever you engage in, the practices bring with them some kinds of demands and values. You have to, eat certain kinds of food and do certain kinds of exercise and avoid certain kinds of other practices. And, so it somehow becomes inescapable. And then even those who are, say, tied to more conventional religious traditions could live those forms of religiosity in ways that make no real demands of them, right? And so it becomes kind of thorny to navigate what is actually a well lived out spiritual practice, whether in the domain of religion or outside.
Yeah. And just to add, I mean, so this is part of the motivation behind the spiritual alienation project. So part of, I mean, all the great spiritual traditions have some sense that things are not as they should be. Things are out of joint in some sense, that
Mm.
there is a spiritual predicament or problem that we're trying to address. In some sense, we're not where we need to be, or to use language from like Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, that we're not yet at the place of spiritual fullness, right? We're in some way, we're on the way maybe, or we feel exiled or alienated from it, but we're not where we need to be. And, I discuss in this current book project 3 perennial forms of spiritual alienation. The first is self-alienation, which is our lack of integration with the good, or lack of wholeheartedness in relation to it. So you think about like Augustine on the divided will, right? Or like Aristotle on acrasia, or like weakness of the will. Sometimes it's translated as, or lack of self-control. You also think here, St. Paul, why do I do the things I don't want to do, or things I hate, and so forth, right? So it's a very common experience that like we're not fully aligned, right? Or you think of the Buddhist tradition on selfish craving and so forth. So like there's ways that we're not fully aligned. Then that often leads to alienation from others when we engage in wrongdoing. And so we find ourselves alienated from others. But also that can just be part of the experience of loneliness that's just sort of endemic to the human condition. And then lastly, there was what I call alienation from the world, which is sort of, that comes, with that philosophical impulse where we feel at a loss in the world. We feel like we're trying to find that orientation, find our place in the world, trying to grapple with evil and suffering, right? And so all those, I think, are part of our coming into moral and spiritual self-consciousness. And so I actually, in the book, I begin with a philosophical reading of the Garden of Eden story, which is a long tradition of this, obviously go back to someone like St. Augustine, but Kant, Hegel, so forth. And one thing I think is interesting, it's often referred to as a fall, but it's also a rise into moral and spiritual self-consciousness, the experience, they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they experience shame. And like there's this, they're exiled from this place of harmonious living, right? So it has this like deep power to speak to us because of like, I think in each of our lives, you might say, we begin in a Garden of Eden. We begin kind of in a state of innocence, simplicity, harmony as young children. But as we grow and develop, we sort of experience alienation. We don't always do the things we think we should do. We feel shame and guilt in relation to others, or we feel like we're trying to discover our place in the world. I think that's just part of the maturation of each human life. And so that's why I think to really get at like the role of spirituality in human life, you have to like, I think you have to make a case that there's like a spiritual predicament that we're trying to address. And so that's why I to just say like like kind of leave everything as it is, a kind of like quietist sort of approach to like where we're at, like I'm fine as I am, is like not to realize maybe the depths of the problem. And if I could just invoke someone I know, probably we're all fans of William James here. He's got this distinction between a religion of healthy mindedness and sort of the sick soul, right? And I think a lot of the great, I think there's actually a place for both. I think maybe healthy mindedness is an aspiration, but we often begin from like that sick soul condition that not all is as it should be. Or, Daryl invoked Kierkegaard earlier. We might think of like the sickness unto death, right? There's this sense, or Pascal, like knowing your wretchedness and your greatness. You have to kind of pair those two things together.
Yeah. Yeah. How would you articulate the heart of the spiritual predicament? I mean, is it that we're sort of looking for some kind of belonging that we don't find in this world? I mean, how would you articulate the heart of that predicament?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I'm trying to, so the book's called Spiritual Alienation and the Quest for God. And so in one sense, it's a kind of traditional project of like saying like some way like this leads us on a quest for God, or it could, the spiritual alienation. There's some way that maybe the desire for God or yearning for God could be derived from that experience of spiritual alienation. Of course, other traditions are going to sort of interpret it differently. But one of the things I actually take on is there are a number of people who like criticize theistic religion as sort of causing alienation. So, famously Nietzsche sort of criticized theistic religions as being otherworldly, right? So it causes alienation from the world. Or there's certain kind of like autonomy objections towards like theistic ethics, right? That it sort of alienates us from our autonomous self. We have to be obedient to the will of God, right? Or maybe like religion causes social conflict. So a number of areas, like people actually argue that like theistic religions can cause alienation. So I get into some of that, and then maybe in some versions it can, but I think at their best, I actually think there's ways that they sort of help us to address that. So for instance, take Nietzsche's criticism that like theistic religion is otherworldly. Well, if you think about the biblical traditions, there's a sense in creation that like the world is, God creates the world and completes it by contemplating it as very good, right? And so we might say the task of the spiritual life is to come to a similar affirmation of the world. And one way a theistic view helps us to do that is it helps us to see the world as gift, right? There's a giftedness of the world. So the world, in some sense, although there's evil and suffering, there's a kind of hospitality to it may seem and sometimes hostile, but it allows us to also see it under the vantage point of a kind of hospitality, like where there's like a giftedness of the world, right? Or you think about going, so if you go to self-alienation, you think about, this ideal of a wholehearted love of God, and then loving your neighbor in some sense is related to that wholehearted love of God as a way of trying to overcome that alienation, self-alienation, right? And likewise with others, you have all these teachings on forgiveness and repentance, right? And one thing I think, just one last point here, just to kind of fill in one last detail, I think loneliness is a really interesting, you see it, it's there in the garden story, right? The Garden of Eden story, that the first, you might say the beginning of the sort of humanizing process, or the coming into like realizing one's humanity, is when God says, it's not good that the man should be alone. It's like first, thing that sort of begins the process. And then Adam, names the animals, and then like distinguishes, sort of says, these aren't like the source that I'm looking for. It's not the source of belonging I'm looking for. And then God creates Eve. It's only at that point, really, that Adam, because that's his first instance of speech, is naming the animals, so distinguishing. And it's like when God creates Eve, it's like, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. It's this longing, right? This loneliness is like this reaching out for some indefinite, something not fully defined that we're seeking fulfillment in. And a lot of great spiritual writers, I think, you think of like Dorothy Day, The Long Loneliness, right?
Right.
I've sort of seen loneliness as having this spiritual implication of like, while, human relationships can go a long ways in addressing that loneliness endemic to the human condition, there's a way in which that loneliness seems to like reach out even beyond the best human relationships to something more, right? As we confront our mortality and the fragility of human existence. And so I think loneliness, if you're kind of like, how does it maybe go in a more like spiritual religious direction? I think loneliness has, it's just one kind of point for how that can occur. And I think it does have a deep spiritual significance potentially.
Yeah. It seems that, one way I'm seeing this is that the heart of it is there's a yearning for connection, right? Whether it's connection to God or higher power, or connection to others, connection to oneself, one's true self, or something like that, connection even to nature, right? Which we can feel alienated from. And it seems that there is this kind of yearning. You're listening to Beauty at Work. This podcast is made possible through support from the John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. Daryl, I wanted to ask, what do you think of alienation as a way to conceptualize what's happening when people encounter these sort of four horsemen? And you have a concept of the existential chasm in your book. Could you talk about how that relates to this notion of alienation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in part, besides cognitive dissonance being kind of a major reason why people are leaving, in another sense, it could be that they're no longer feeling as though their religion is meeting their needs, and they're somehow feeling alienated from their religious teachings or institutions or from other religious individuals. And so the process of leaving religion for those who are undergoing a major belief revision that's landed them outside of traditional religion, I introduced this idea of the existential chasm, and it goes something like this. So religion addresses a lot of core existential needs. What's the meaning of life? What happens to me after I die? When people leave religion, they have to answer those questions again without religion. And so they're facing these new existential fears afresh without being able to rely on religion to provide them with ready answers. And so there's two kind of unique things about this. One is if they've previously known what it was like to, let's say, believe in the afterlife, and maybe that's a belief that they've jettisoned, that's going to bring about a whole lot of grief, because if you comforted yourself by losing a loved one or a friend by believing that they would live on in the afterlife, and you no longer believe that, you might be grieving them again. And if you've oriented your life around where to go to college, what profession to choose, whom to marry or partner off with based on your religious beliefs, and now you no longer hold those, you might grieve having spent so much of your life in so many major life decisions oriented around something that you no longer believe. So you're facing these new existential challenges in a brand new way, no longer having the structures of religion, but knowing what it was like. And then the second piece is, for many people who are raised religiously, they may not have developed the skills or the capacities or the habits of critically thinking about how to engage these existential concerns on their own, because they might have been given a kind of a complete comprehensive worldview through religion to address these concerns. And so there's this gap. So existential anxiety is likely heightened among people who have left religion because they can't rely on or are no longer relying on religion to meet those needs, and they're facing them once again. And so for these folks, existential concerns are going to loom larger, and they might feel like they don't have much of a place to turn, and they feel more alienated and alone.
Yeah. So how does one respond to that? I mean, you talk about cultivating some kind of spiritual practice as one route. And is that something that people long for? And I suppose maybe the question that I could also ask is, in the aftermath of leaving religion, is there a kind of yearning, or do people shut it off and say, I'm just going to live my life according to something else?
Yeah, in some of our recent work with colleagues, what we're finding is that, people are yearning. So we've done some work with religious duns and people who've never been religious, and we ask them, are you looking for something more? And among those, they've got mild yearnings, and they're kind of looking for a few things. So one of the things they're looking for is something that looks and seems like and feels like religion, but isn't religion. So basically something to replicate what religion gave them, but without the costly parts of religion. They're looking for connection with other people, right? They're looking for that community. They're also looking for transcendent connection and lasting meaning. Like, they want to know that whatever they're doing here is going to be remembered and is going to make a difference over the long term. And then the last thing they're really yearning for are these supernatural experiences. And religion offers those. And outside of religion, it's really hard to get some of those supernatural experiences, which, David alluded to the idea that maybe that's why we're seeing this uptick in interest in psychedelics, is maybe, is it this way to quickly get to supernatural experiences without, in some cases, traditional religious structures. I similarly share the belief that spiritual yearning is probably just as natural as a desire to make meaning. So to the degree that we're trying to make sense of of the world around us and our place in the world. We're natural meaning makers. And one of the deepest and most enduring ways that you can make meaning is by connecting with something larger than yourself. And that's really this feeling or sense of transcendent spirituality. So yeah, when people leave, it's not as if they no longer have spiritual needs or long for something larger than themselves. They're probably just looking for it in different areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How much do you think that people who leave religion really need to cultivate some kind of spiritual practice? Is that necessary? Is it, are these sorts of needs that they, once could find answers for in religion important? Is this a universal human quality that we ought to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are other sources of spirituality besides religion. So I think of spirituality as that relational connection with the transcendent or divine or sacred. And religion's one of the vehicles through which people can experience spiritual connection, but they can experience it in nature, through the cosmos, through connecting with other humans, through an authentic and sense of integrity within themselves. So I do think that there are features that allow for spiritual connection or transcendence, but should we be cultivating these, right? Or should we, is it an important thing? I would say probably so. I don't, and people are going to have different perspectives on this, and there's going to be individual differences and variation, but I don't think that we should neglect or let wither something that has long been a part of human flourishing across millennia, across cultures. There's always been this notion of the spiritual, of something larger than oneself. And I do think that's important to attend to and important for us to consider, not letting what let wither, but instead, how do we cultivate some type of spiritual practices that will meet those needs, even if it looks different from how it's previously been done in traditionally organized religious settings?
Yeah. There might be people who, I know, we've encountered some scientists who say, look, I don't care about spirituality. I don't even know what you mean by connection when you ask me that question.
Right.
Like, what do you think of that kind of, like, is it possible to be completely sort of tone deaf to the spiritual, or just not need it at all and still live a flourishing life?
Yeah, I certainly think that there are people for whom what we're talking about just is absolutely of no interest to them, or they don't really spend much of their day thinking about these types of questions. And probably by every kind of measure and metric, they would probably report their lives probably just fine. Like, it's meaningful enough. They've got work if they're able to. They've got relationships if, they likely have relationships. Maybe they have a hobby. So they have things to fill their time. And they probably have things that make their life quite meaningful. And one might imagine, though, that even richer sense of meaning might be available to those who are willing to cultivate a sense of spirituality. But I would not presume that a lack of spirituality means that someone is living necessarily in a deficit.
Mm-hmm. David, what do you think in terms of, as human beings, as meaning-seeking creatures, is the sort of response of someone who says, look, I don't need this stuff? How do you make sense of that? Is it just that there's enough scaffolding that they don't have to confront themselves with universal questions that percolate from within us? Or is that just that there is, is there a viable way of living a human, like maybe a life of fullness that doesn't require dealing with these existential questions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I want to add one thing just kind of on the spiritual alienation bit, because I think it connects up with this. I think it's helpful to distinguish between spiritual alienation and religious alienation. So I think, for instance, a lot of Daryl's work is on what I might call religious alienation. So people who are like done with religion or sort of in some way alienated from religion. And one of the interesting questions is like, does that make the spiritual search more difficult? Does it exacerbate the sort of more fundamental spiritual alienation that sort of I argue we all have, right? I mean, a great example of this is Nietzsche's when he proclaims the death of God. He sort of describes two experiences. One is a kind of, you might call it existential vertigo, where it's like which way is up, which way is down. You're trying to find an orientation in life, right? Trying to find a meaningful life orientation. And then the second experience is, at least he describes as a more positive one, which is this experience of like an open sea of like possibilities that is sort of like you're liberated from certain kinds of restrictions. So for some people, they may actually find it easier, right? If they're sort of throwing off some baggage from their past, although they're sort of tasked with this, like, which path then, right? And I do think spiritual practices do play an important role just as vehicles of our longing, right? their ways of, whether it's prayer or meditation or whatever it might be, I think that they play an important role as vehicles of our longing. Now, I do find this question very interesting of like the person who like says that they don't have any spiritual longings. They're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So like Max Weber famously, he said that he was religiously unmusical, that he just, in other words, he didn't resonate with sort of like religious or spiritual questions. But nevertheless, when he was like asked like why he does his work, he said, I want to see how much I can stand, right? It's sort of this image of like this courageous person facing the bleakness of reality and carrying on nevertheless, right? And so I think oftentimes there are these sources of meaning. So even if they don't find any larger meaning in the cosmos, they may find personal meaning just in sort of confronting this. Now, of course, there are cases of like people who just go through their lives and maybe don't reflect on it too much, right? But this is sort of that midlife crisis experience that can come up. Like you might think just, being human, like there's just questions that are going to arise sooner or later, right? You come up against some failure in your life, or you come up against mortality, or you come up against a tragedy and suffering. You're trying to make sense of it, right? And so this is a sense in which, like, while people might not frame it as like spirit, like some of it's the framing of like spiritual longing, right? But you might switch to like thinking about meaning, right? So another way to think about like spiritual yearning is just to talk about in terms of like the search for meaning. And I do think we are fundamentally meaning-seeking creatures, and we seek meaning in lives. We want our lives to be significant. We want our lives to matter. So I think in that sense, sometimes you just have to frame the reference. I mean, like spirituality can sound spooky to people. Like it can sound like ghosts and goblins and whatnot, right? I mean, so it's like,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like what,
yeah,
like, and
yeah.
people are maybe of a more kind of like spirit or soul or whatever that they may not. I mean, partly I just think of it as this realm, what you might call, as one philosopher John McDowell calls it, the space of meaning, right? We live in the space of meaning. We sort of swim in it. We're already in the midst of it. So in that sense, I think if we reframe it as like search for meaning or search for fullness, I think as you did yourself, I think it's more easier to see how that's kind of a universal human quest. So sometimes I think it's the language or the baggage associated with certain language that can hold us up. But maybe there are people like, I don't seek meaning. I just want to. Sometimes I'll use this what I call the Jim Morrison position. The lead singer of the Doors at the end of their live album at the end of Roadhouse Blues, he's talking about like astrology and all these sort of things. He says, I don't believe in it though. I think it's a bunch of bullshit. I tell you this though, I'm gonna get my kicks in before the whole shit house goes up in flames, right? And it's sort of this like he's just gonna seek pleasure, right? And so that would seem to be like example of like if someone's just kind of living more, you might call like in a non-human animalistic kind of way, but it's not even clear that that's fully possible. I mean, Kierkegaard will talk about this with his account of the aesthete, the person who lives for the kind of immediacy of the moment. And the problem is you get bored and you begin to reflect upon your life. And so while not all the time are we always engaged in sort of meaning-seeking activities or like what we might call spiritual yearnings, I think they have a way of cropping up. And sometimes I think like thou dost protest too much when people are like, I'm religiously unmusical. Like clearly like Weber, for instance, was very moved by and attuned to the sort of hard, big questions. I mean, he's the one who sort of coined the term the disenchantment of the world, right? And how do we go on in science as like, in the face of like disenchantment, right? So I would say he's a person very alive to what we might call spiritual or existential questions. So maybe existential could be, and Daryl I know uses this framing as well, sometimes existential. So I think it's how you frame it, I guess, is how I would put it.
Yeah, I wonder at times whether we build lives to inoculate ourselves from these questions because they are pesky, right? They have a way of erupting, and these aren't questions that or maybe some of us could sit around and sort of ask these questions in a kind of laconic way, but that's not how often they crop up, right? There seems to be a kind of it's almost like I have this image of even like a plant sort of shooting up from hard rocky ground, right? So it's almost when the cracks in our narratives, our societal narratives or our personal narratives start to reveal themselves, or we've got some kind of breakdown in our routines and habits, and unexpected tragedies are often the ways in which some of these things might crop up, and then we have to either really shore up a defense against these questions in some way, or just try to live them. The question of yearning becomes interesting because the yearning has a kind of it's not just a pesky question, but then there's also this longing, there's almost desire, right? That's built into it. And there's David, you're familiar with this Seinfeld clip, right? Which we shared at the convening we were at a few months ago, where Kramer sidles up to George and asks him if he ever yearns, and George says, "Well, yearn? Well, I crave sometimes." and and can we live lives that are entirely lives dedicated to following cravings, but not yearning? And is that a reasonable account of fullness, to just pursue craving?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Because I was thinking about this when you were mentioning your Buddhist scientist friend earlier, because of course the Buddhist, like teaching is like the problem of selfish craving, right? But it doesn't necessarily, I mean, there's ways I think of reading the Buddhist tradition as like totally allowing for yearning, right? Like this, we're trying to achieve this state of nirvana, right? We yearn for it, where we're not sort of consumed by sort of selfish craving, where we're acting more compassionate, more in tune with the world in some way, right? And so I think we have to distinguish between like kinds of desires. There's like, those appetitive kind of like maybe selfish cravings, the sort of thing that maybe Jim Morrison was talking about when he wanted to get his kicks in, right? But then there's like the yearning, which I think, I mean, sometimes that language can sound overwrought, like, oh, I yearn, like, and so some people may react to the overwroughtness of the sound of I yearn for this, right? But I think it's usually, I mean, it's hard not to see it as involving this strong normative dimension. Like we yearn, if we put it maybe in like Platonic terms, like for the good or for the beautiful, right? I'm thinking of your podcast name here, right? Reflecting on beauty, right? That calls out a deep longing from us, right? This sort of reaching out to something, some mode of existence where we feel like we'll be more as we should be, or, have that experience of fulfillment or a deeper sense of meaning in life. And so there is this like more strongly like normative dimension to yearning or longing. We feel in a way called or like drawn to it in some way, right? That's different than craving, right? I mean, like it's like you have a craving, you have a like desire to scratch an itch, right? I mean, but that's different from like longing for like connection with your spouse or with others around the world or with nature. There's some sense we feel called or drawn into some deeper sense of goodness, of purpose. And I think it isn't, I mean, longing is another term, comes from a German roots that sort of like means like lying and like reaching out, right? It's like kind of reaching out. I think it goes back to like that experience of like loneliness too. It's like a reaching out for something that we think would fulfill us. And so I actually think it's hard to like completely articulate it because it has this open-ended quality to it. When we yearn for something, we're not quite sure, but we think something's maybe missing. It's like when we have that experience of something maybe missing in our lives that we yearn for something, right? And we yearn for that deeper connection with others, with the good, however we want to describe it.
Yeah. There's a philosopher of aesthetics, Crispin Starkwell, who argues that he defines beauty as the object of our longing. Whatever it is we're longing for, that's what beauty is. And that's an interesting kind of way of characterizing beauty. And I'm curious to know, maybe Daryl, like, what do you think psychologically the valences of these yearnings are? I don't know if you've already seen this in your research, but is it oriented towards something that one could call beauty? And also, do you see any kind of personality dimension? Like, are there some personality types that yearn more than others?
Yeah, so we were actually quite curious, like, are these yearnings a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like, if I'm yearning, maybe it's a deficit, but maybe if I'm yearning, it's, well, I want to grow in some way. So far, the early returns on the data suggest that yearnings are seen as mildly positive. So it's not bad. So when people are experiencing yearning, this isn't an aversive thing. So that's one thing we've realized. We haven't yet gotten into the personality features. It's on our list. So stay tuned for that. I don't want to speak ahead of the data. I could make some predictions, but we're still not quite there. But I would be quite curious to see if there are people that are more naturally inclined to yearn, right? If they're higher in openness to new experience, for example, we might imagine they might be more likely to yearn. But we're not quite sure yet. The data aren't there.
Yeah. I have, an image of like, a life that is driven by yearning versus its various other alternatives. I mean, certainly one would be the kind of maybe scaffolded life where one is insulated from this, which I'd mentioned. An alternative might be or maybe this is also a form of the scaffolded life, but it's a caricature of Jane Austen's sort of world of, restrained people, like Victorian England or something of that sort, where if you look at the life of Yearning as, say, a Sufi mystic, or like a desert father, or one of those people living out this deep spiritual yearning, you could see these other modes of life perhaps as being alternatives that for some are compelling, or at least, one could say there's a virtuous life being lived out in the Victorian mode. I don't personally find that a really, I don't know. It seems that it requires so much social scaffolding to be able to construct that sort of life, that it seems, anyway, psychologically sort of not really a sustainable project. And somehow, if we could figure out how to better confront and encounter and deal with these existential questions, it might actually serve us better. But that might be my prejudice. I don't know. Daryl, what do you think as a psychologist in terms of thinking about fullness from a psychological perspective?
So I could not agree with you more. I could not agree with you more that I think that the only pathway to authentic flourishing is through an acceptance and a real engagement with existential realities. I think a lot of psychological dis-ease, a lot of defensiveness, a lot of interpersonal conflict, intragroup turmoil, ideologically motivated violence stems from our inability or unwillingness to see existential concerns as the realities they are. And so if we could work together personally and collectively to embrace these existential realities as truths and not threats, as facts and not fears, I think that it would be transformative, because that's the only way to fully appreciate what it means to be a bounded human, and then make decisions in light of that to engage in a full and flourishing life. Otherwise, we're just reacting, we're being defensive, we're trying to skirt the issue or avoid the fact that we have to encounter these fundamental features of being human. We're running from and trying to elude our human boundedness. And I think embracing it is the only pathway to flourish.
Do you have recommendations for how one would go about doing that? What could that look like?
Well, it's not easy. I think a big reason why we've evolved these complex and sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms is it's rather terrifying. And I think, Brandon, I think you mentioned it, that, I think suffering and adversity have a way of thrusting these existential realities into the forefront of our minds. And it's harder to avoid. One of the recommendations is, when people experience adversity, suffering, when they encounter the harsh realities of the existential concerns, that they use that time to really engage with them and start seeing them for what they are and start accepting them. It's much easier to do in the comfort and luxury when you're feeling, when life is more settled and you're not undergoing, the maelstrom of stress and adversity. But we often don't seek that out because we don't want to psychologically rock the boat. Irvin Yalom has a book called Staring at the Sun, and it's kind of coming to terms with, for example, like death. And so it's basically like we have to habituate ourselves over time to these types of realities. And so, there's been work on, for example, terror management theory, which suggests that reminders of death make people really defensive. But then what they found was these trends are reversed among older adults. And the reason for that was because they were thinking, well, they're just more habituated in the reminders of their own mortality. Their friends are dying, they're thinking about it. So the more we talk about and can actually embrace these existential concerns, I think the more habituated we will become, and the less defensive and reactive we will be. So having these conversations, actually engaging in them in times of calm and peace, but also in times of suffering and adversity, the more we have these conversations and the more people are willing to take the hard look, the more able they will become to move toward acceptance rather than defensiveness.
Thank you. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking, so you were asking about humility earlier, or you mentioned it as something we might come back to here. And so I think, Daryl mentioned acceptance, and sort of brought me back to mind of my most recent book is called The Virtues of Limits. And I talk about these, what I call two fundamental existential stances. One is the accepting, appreciating stance, and the other is the choosing, controlling stance. And I think both are actually really important in human life. And the sort of trick is how to get it right. If you go like too far in acceptance, it just becomes a kind of quietism, right? Where you just sort of like let things lie. You don't try any kind of change or improvement in one's life. The choosing, controlling stance we take up whenever we seek improvement but it can also become this kind of Promethean project of mastery, right? It can also be going back to kind of what you were saying, Brandon, earlier about trying to insulate yourself, right? So I think humility is really important because I think it sort of acknowledges that it's a sort of proper recognition of our place in the world. And I think it's actually really closely connected with reverence, that there are things of value beyond ourselves, maybe even of greater value. So it helps to define your proper place in the scheme of things, so to speak. But I think humility also allows for a kind of proper receptivity. So I think one of the things that we need to cultivate is I think we think a lot in sort of modern American culture about individual choice and control and so forth, but cultivating like a posture of receptivity is much more difficult. And I think if you look at a lot of the sort of ancient spiritual practices, a lot of them involve what we might call practices of receptivity, whether that's like prayer or meditation, contemplation, right? And so I think that's really one of the greater challenges. I'm brought to mind of like Pascal's remark that, sort of the great sort of besetting condition is that we don't know how to like sit quietly alone in our rooms, right? We're always sort of trying to constantly distract ourselves. It's a sort of expression of our sort of spiritual predicament, trying to avoid, I kind of back to your comment about insulating ourselves, right? We're really good at distracting ourselves, and our modern technologies have made that all the more easy, right? And so to try to cultivate modes of receptivity or sort of proper responsiveness to the sort of the good and the beautiful and the true that's all around us, I think is one of the real challenge. Like you think of Matthew Crawford's book, The World Outside of Your Head, the sort of issue of attention, which, you see that in Iris Murdoch or Simone Weil, this issue that attention is a really important part of the spiritual life, and it's a receptive mode of being. It's kind of, Simone Weil talks about waiting on God. We could talk about like waiting for the good or the beautiful, trying to be receptive to like what comes to us. And so in that sense, I think it is kind of like a spiritual task to learn how to be properly attentive or receptive to sort of the existential realities that are all around us. We can try to ignore them. That's why we distract ourselves. But it does seem like sooner or later we come up against them. So why not just work on dealing with them now rather than being sort of caught off guard, so to speak. But, probably still will be caught off guard because that's the human condition. But yeah, no, I think, it gets to, I think, something really important and connects with this issue of humility that I think is really important.
It seems that attention becomes incredibly fraught resource in a world in which there's so much monetary incentive to colonize our attention, right? And so there are lots of powers that stand to gain from fracking our attention, as D. Graham Burnett puts it. So it's a tough battle. What questions do you guys have for each other? I know you all are in conversation with as part of your own project on this, but is there anything that comes up that you want to ask?
Yeah, we've been talking for a bit. It's been wonderful. I think I've just been very interested in the empirical side, sort of that Daryl looks at with the people who are dones or nuns, like what are their experiences? So I think Daryl already touched on some of this. Do they have spiritual longings? Maybe one in the moment would, so I mentioned, sort of from my philosopher's armchair, I kind of have this sense that there's challenges and opportunities, I guess, in terms of spiritual yearning and spiritual, seeking meaning. There is that, go back to Nietzsche, that sort of sense of disorientation that can arise. And I think Daryl touches on that with the existential chasm. But maybe also that side of spiritual possibilities. Daryl, do you find that like that there's a sense, that people feel like there's these spiritual possibilities, that things are like sort of opened up to them in a way? Or is it like maybe like almost too much choice? This is something Taylor talks about in A Secular Age, sort of the optionality of different perspectives. Like we can almost feel like paralyzed and like not knowing where to go, which path to choose. What do you see on that, Daryl?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. So I do think that there are these twin, right? It's kind of those twin feelings again of awe and dread, right? It's the twin feelings of grief and sadness and fear, but also awe and wonder and curiosity. So I kind of think about it as when they're in the existential chasm, there's the sense of being untethered. And for some people who are high on a growth orientation, that feels great. And it feels good to have the world of possibilities. But for those who are high in security orientation, being untethered feels very groundless, and that feels very anxiety provoking. And sometimes we can have both of those feelings within us, just depending on the context. And so, yeah, I think that there's a combination of possibility and concern, of anxiety and curiosity, of wonder and of fear. Wonder and fear sometimes are very closely, there's a thin line between those two. And I think that's one of the areas we're seeing that. Yeah, David, I guess just for you, my one last question, David, would be, what do you see as the future? If you're seeing an increasing spiritual alienation, if you were to prognosticate, what would you see moving forward?
Yeah, so I don't think religion's going to go away, for instance. I think they're just sort of tried and true practices, and they also meet needs for human belonging. So I wouldn't accept going back to sort of like there's the death of God view of secularization, where like religion's just going to completely fade away. And in fact, just on like birth rates alone, I know Pew has sort of estimated the world's getting more religious, just not maybe in like America or Europe. But yeah, it's hard to predict the future. Prognostication is not typically my forte, but I think we can expect, if it is true that we are sort of meaning-seeking creatures, we are, and we have a spiritual predicament. I think the great spiritual traditions are always going to offer sort of pathways. And I think for belonging, for spiritual practices that sort of orient us towards the good. But I think oftentimes what we'll have is people, Robert Wuffnow has this distinction between seekers and dwellers. And so I think we do have a world of seekers, but I think even dwellers are going to be seekers as well. So you might call it kind of a seeker-dweller conjunction that people like, they may sort of have eclectic spiritual practices, or they may sort of inhabit a spiritual tradition, but seek from out of that, spiritual religious tradition. And so I think spiritual seeking is going to continue. And I think, in some ways, I think that what the data suggests on like the rise of the nuns is that, some of what you have is sort of like low practicing. The amount of like people are like, like very serious in their practice is maybe roughly the same, but it may even decrease more. That certainly has happened in Europe. So it's hard to prognosticate, but kind of going back to your points, religions have addressed these existential concerns. And so it's hard to see the great religions as sort of completely being eradicated. I think their numbers may be less, but they're going to be there as sort of resources for people who are spiritually seeking. And so I just don't think spiritual longing or seeking is going to go. I think that's what I feel most confident saying, is that it's not going away. It's just part of the human condition. And I think because traditional religions are sort of, tested practices, and they've been helpful for people, sometimes not helpful, but oftentimes helpful as well. I think they'll continue to have a role in human life, even if maybe somewhat of a reduced role than it has been in the past. That's my best prognosis. I'm not going to give you numbers or percentages or
no, that's
above my
great.
pay
That's
grade.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's super important to think about, and I think especially in a context in which there's a lot of incentives for various entities to prey on all of our longings and yearnings, right? And whether for belonging or to connect with others, etc., and to cultivate healthy forms of healthy responses to those yearnings becomes really, really critical. So we'll direct our readers and listeners to your websites. And is there anything else anything else you're working on or that's coming out that you want to draw people's attention to?
I don't think so.
No, I appreciate you directing them to our books, and your readers and listeners will know that we're both working independently, but also collaboratively on some work on spiritual yearning. So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll be able to report back on what the future holds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Brandon. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, for me too. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.